There's a dangerous illusion built into the way people think about collapse. The illusion is simple, that when powerful countries fail, it will look dramatic, sudden, and obvious. Tanks in the streets, governments falling overnight, headlines screaming catastrophe. But history almost never works like that. Real collapse doesn't begin with explosions. It begins with systems quietly losing their ability to solve problems faster than they create them. And by the time it becomes visible, it is already far deeper than anyone wants to admit. Right now, as you're watching this, 7 countries are moving through different stages of that exact process. Not identical situations, not identical causes, but the same underlying pattern. Institutions under stress, legitimacy eroding, and societies slowly losing confidence in their own future. And the most unsettling part is that some of these countries don't look like failures at all. In fact, they look stable on the surface. That is exactly what makes them dangerous to misread. Because collapse rarely begins in places that already look broken. It begins in places that believe they are still safe. To understand what's happening, you have to abandon the idea that collapse is an event. Collapse is not an event. It is a process of accumulated strain, like a bridge that slowly weakens under invisible pressure until one final load pushes it past the point of recovery. And every society gives warning signals long before that point arrives. The problem is not that the signals don't exist. The problem is that most people are trained not to interpret them. Modern life amplifies distraction. Every day brings new crises, new political arguments, new economic fears, new cultural battles. But while attention is pulled toward the surface level noise, deeper structural changes continue underneath. Debt accumulates, institutions weaken, populations age, trust declines, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the system loses flexibility, until one day it can no longer respond the way it used to. And everyone asks the same question, how did this happen so fast? It didn't happen fast. What feels sudden is usually the final visible stage of something that is And that is when even small shocks can produce disproportionate effects. But Pakistan is only one part of a broader global pattern emerging across multiple regions at once. Because the fourth country introduces a different dimension entirely, demographic and institutional disruption caused not by internal collapse, but by external shock. Ukraine is often analyzed primarily through military terms, but that perspective misses a deeper structural transformation. Wars do not only destroy infrastructure, they redistribute populations, fragment communities, and reshape demographic realities for generations. Millions have left the country. Millions are displaced internally. Entire communities have been separated across borders. And even when conflict eventually stabilizes, the question is not simply whether reconstruction is possible, but what is actually being reconstructed. Because rebuilding roads and buildings is straightforward compared to rebuilding social continuity, a country is not just territory. It is networks of trust, shared experience, institutional memory, and generational connection. When those elements are dispersed across multiple countries, reconstruction becomes a different kind of challenge entirely. And historically, once large populations settle abroad for extended periods, return rates are low, unless conditions at home significantly exceed conditions abroad. That creates a paradox. The people needed for reconstruction are often the ones least likely to return. This is not unique to Ukraine. It is a recurring pattern in modern conflicts. But the scale and geopolitical significance make it particularly consequential. Because Ukraine's demographic future is not just a national issue, it is a regional one. It affects labor markets, migration patterns, and long-term economic structures across multiple countries simultaneously. And that brings us to the next group of countries, where collapse takes a different form again. Economic dependency on a model that is no longer stable. Nigeria, Argentina, and Bangladesh each represent variations of this pattern. Economies that experienced periods of strong growth, often driven by external demand, commodity cycles, or labor advantages, but did not fully convert that growth into resilient institutional foundations. Nigeria's dependence on oil revenue created a state structure heavily tied to a single source of income, making it vulnerable to price fluctuations and limiting diversification. Argentina's repeated cycles of debt and inflation reflect deeper structural challenges in fiscal credibility and political consensus. Bangladesh's remarkable development, progress in manufacturing and poverty reduction now faces pressure from global economic shifts and internal political constraints. What connects these cases is not failure of growth, but failure to convert growth into resilience. Economic expansion creates opportunity, but without institutional strengthening, that opportunity remains temporary. And temporary systems eventually encounter limits, because the world changes faster than systems built on temporary advantages can adapt. And that is the hidden thread connecting all 7 countries. Not geography, not ideology, not culture, but time. Every one of these societies relied, at some point, on a condition that was assumed to continue. A commodity cycle, a political arrangement, a development model, a geopolitical alignment, a demographic structure, a narrative of progress, and every one of those conditions is temporary. The mistake is not relying on temporary conditions. Every society does that. The mistake is failing to use those temporary periods to build something that survives when they end. Because history has a consistent rule. Temporary stability always ends. The only question is what remains when it does. And in these 7 cases, what remains is a system under stress, still functioning, still operating, but increasingly constrained by the weight of its own unresolved contradictions. And once you recognize that pattern, you start seeing it everywhere. Not as collapse, but as accumulation. And accumulation, once it reaches a certain point, stops being invisible. The most dangerous stage of collapse is not when everything is falling apart. It is when everything still appears to be working, but the internal logic of the system has already begun to shift. Because at that point, institutions continue operating, governments continue announcing policies, markets continue trading, and life continues in its normal rhythm. But underneath that rhythm, something fundamental has changed. The system is no longer expanding its capacity to solve problems. It is now mostly managing the consequences of problems it can no longer fully control. And that is where the focus shifts to the country that sits at the center of the entire global structure. Not because it is uniquely fragile, but because it is uniquely exposed. It is exposed to financial cycles, demographic trends, technological disruption, political polarization, and global instability all at the same time. And the most unsettling part is that none of these pressures are new. What is new is their synchronization. Because when multiple stress factors begin reinforcing each other instead of operating independently, systems stop behaving predictably. At first glance, nothing looks abnormal. Economic indicators still function. Elections still happen. Institutions still operate. Courts still issue rulings. Markets still respond to policy signals. But that is exactly what makes this stage so deceptive. Collapse does not begin by breaking institutions. It begins by changing how institutions are perceived. And perception matters more than most people realize. Because institutions do not function only through enforcement. They function through belief. A legal system works because people believe rulings will be enforced. A currency works because people believe it will retain value. A government works because people believe decisions will be implemented consistently. Once that belief starts weakening, even slowly, institutions begin to require more force to produce the same outcomes. That is the first quiet signal, not failure, friction. Friction increases in small, almost invisible ways. Political disagreement becomes more absolute. Compromise becomes more difficult. Policy cycles become shorter and more reactive. Long-term planning begins to give way to short-term stabilization. Governments increasingly respond to events instead of shaping them. And over time, the system starts to lose strategic depth. Because strategic depth requires trust in continuity, and continuity requires shared expectations about the future. But when societies become fragmented in how they interpret reality, shared expectations begin to dissolve. That fragmentation is not random, it is structural. It is driven by information ecosystems that no longer produce a unified public narrative. Instead, different groups operate inside different interpretive frameworks. They see the same events but understand them in incompatible ways. And when interpretation becomes fragmented, coordination becomes fragile. This is where political polarization becomes more than disagreement. It becomes structural separation. Because once groups stop agreeing on basic facts, they also stop agreeing on what problems matter, how urgent they are, and what solutions are legitimate. And at that point, governance stops being a shared project and becomes a competition between incompatible realities. But even this is still not the deepest layer of stress. The deeper layer is fiscal and structural inertia. Modern states rely heavily on debt systems to smooth over economic transitions. Debt is not inherently a problem. It becomes a problem when it replaces structural reform instead of supporting it. When governments use borrowing not to invest in future capacity, but to maintain present stability, they gradually accumulate obligations that constrain future options. And the key issue is not the size of debt itself, but its trajectory relative to growth and productivity. When obligations grow faster than the system's ability to expand its productive base, fiscal space narrows. And when fiscal space narrows, policy flexibility declines. That means fewer options during crises, less room for maneuver, more dependence on short-term fixes. And this creates a subtle but powerful effect. Systems begin to feel stable in normal times but increasingly brittle during shocks, like a structure that looks solid under light pressure but responds poorly when stress is applied unevenly. But even fiscal pressure alone does not explain systemic fragility. The third layer is demographic. Demographics are slow, but they are absolute. They do not respond to policy cycles or election timelines. They operate over decades. And in many advanced economies, demographic trends are moving in a consistent direction. Aging populations, declining birth rates, and increasing dependency ratios. This changes everything, because a shrinking workforce must support a growing retired population while also sustaining healthcare systems, infrastructure, and debt obligations. At the same time, economic systems are designed around expansion, not contraction. So when demographics shift, every assumption embedded in long-term planning begins to weaken. And governments face a structural contradiction. Either they increase immigration to compensate, which creates political tension, or they increase productivity dramatically, which requires technological and institutional adaptation that often takes decades. There is no simple resolution, only trade-offs. But trade-offs themselves are politically destabilizing when societies are already polarized. Which brings everything back to the same point. Layers of stress interacting instead of remaining separate. Economic pressure interacts with political fragmentation. Political fragmentation interacts with institutional distrust. Institutional distrust interacts with demographic strain. And together, these interactions produce a system that is still operational but increasingly constrained. And constraint is what defines the current phase. Not collapse. Constraint. But constraint has a direction. It reduces the range of possible futures. It shortens planning horizons. It increases sensitivity to shocks. It forces decisions into narrower windows of time. And eventually, it creates conditions where small events can produce large systemic reactions. Because when systems lose flexibility, they become nonlinear. And nonlinear systems are unpredictable. That is why comparing modern states to historical collapses is both useful and misleading. Useful because the patterns of stress are similar. Misleading because the speed of information, capital, and population movement today is fundamentally different. In earlier eras, collapse often unfolded over decades or even centuries. Today, transmission is faster. Financial panic spreads instantly. Political narratives spread globally in real time. Migration flows respond rapidly to instability. Supply chains amplify disruption across continents. This means that once instability begins, it does not remain local for long. But that does not mean collapse is inevitable. It means the threshold between stability and instability is thinner than before. And that is where the comparison with earlier countries becomes important again. Because France, Ethiopia, Pakistan, Ukraine, Nigeria, Argentina, and Bangladesh all show different versions of the same structural pattern. Systems under strain that are still functioning, but increasingly dependent on conditions that are no longer stable. Some depend on fiscal stability. Some depend on political cohesion. Some depend on demographic balance. Some depend on external economic demand. Some depend on institutional legitimacy. But in every case, the dependency is fragile. And when dependency is fragile, continuity depends on maintaining conditions that are themselves unstable, which creates a paradox. Stability depends on instability remaining controlled, and that is never guaranteed. But there is another layer that connects all of this, and it is often ignored because it is harder to measure than economics or politics. It is belief. Not ideological belief, but systemic belief. The belief that the system can adapt, that problems are solvable within existing structures, that institutions respond to pressure in predictable ways. When that belief weakens, societies do not immediately collapse. Instead, they begin to behave differently. They invest less in long-term futures. They migrate more. They polarize more. They trust less. They coordinate less. And over time, these behavioral changes feed back into the system itself, making adaptation even harder. That feedback loop is the core mechanism of modern fragility. Because systems do not collapse only from external shocks. They collapse when internal confidence in adaptation breaks down faster than institutions can adjust. And once that happens, even solvable problems begin to behave like unsolvable ones. That is why the 7 countries in the first part matter. Not because they represent isolated failures, but because they represent different entry points into the same structural condition. A condition where stability is no longer self-reinforcing. And when stability stops reinforcing itself, it must be actively maintained. But maintenance is not the same as resilience. Maintenance is effort. Resilience is structure. And the global system is slowly shifting from one to the other without fully acknowledging it. Which leads to the final question. If multiple countries are simultaneously entering this phase of constraint, and if those countries are interconnected through finance, trade, migration, and information systems, then the real issue is no longer whether individual states are stable. The real issue is whether stability itself is becoming harder to sustain across the system as a whole. Because if that is true, then the 7 countries are not anomalies. They are early indicators. And the system has not yet finished revealing what those indicators mean.